All right. Well, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started talking about art history in Fond du Lac County. 1 second here. We'll get the PowerPoint up on the screen. All right. Okay. So today we're going to talk about 4 artists from Fond du Lac County and its history. So they are all people who have made an impact on art here in Fond du Lac, and we're excited to talk about them today. All right, our first artist today is Mark Robert Harrison. Now, Mr. Harrison was born in England back in the 1830s. So he lived there with his parents, but then he immigrated to New York and then later Canada. And as a young man, he was very much an artist and really had the opportunity, since his parents were middle class, that he could go to art school. And he traveled around Europe, but he mainly stuck to schools inside of the UK. And his art style is called landscape Western. So with his art style, he really focused on nature. And as you can see in the 2 paintings here, you can see that they're very romantic and very beautiful views of the Wisconsin and Western United States landscapes. The first painting we have is on the left, and that is the first house in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. So this was a painting Mark had done, given some explanation from some residents of Fond du Lac at that time who were around Fond du Lac when the site was first populated. And as you can see, it shows kind of a peaceful scene of settlers and natives getting together and trading. Now, Mark Robert Harrison did live in Fond du Lac in the 1860s through about 1878. During that time, he was really involved in the community. He sponsored a lot of projects, did a lot of portraits and paintings for people, especially in the Fox Valley area. And he also had quite a bit of a following in art students. One of his students was Edward Mascraft, and he's another featured painter here from the Fond du Lac area. But he was very well known for his paintings, especially those here in Fond du Lac. He also had made some paintings while he lived in Canada, and he was very much into the idea of a diorama. Now, unlike your shoebox diorama that most of us would think of today, these types of diorama were like a walk-in movie theater. You would be fully immersed, and on all 4 sides of a tent would have these massive paintings, almost murals, and they would be depicting various scenes. Mark Harrison favored ones that were biblical or were related to the founding of the United States. These were very big, and they were created with a lot of oil paint, which made it quite a fire hazard. So his first 2 dioramas actually burned to the ground, and he was creating one here in Fond du Lac prior to his death. Now on the next slide here, we can see one of his paintings. This one was done in 1887, so we believe this one was done here in Fond du Lac shortly before his death. And you can see that it is depicting a group of Native Americans, and at that time it was a very popular style of art to have in your home, was ones related to Native American culture and life. And you can see with the detail to the background as well, he had that big focus on nature as well. And like I said, he was very popular for his Western style, and you can find his paintings across Canada as well as the US today, though the majority of his later works are here in Wisconsin. The next artist we're going to talk about is Owen Gromme. He's a Fond du Lac son, was born on Lake Winnebago in the 1890s, and he had a lifelong passion for the study of birds and wildlife. He grew up fishing and hunting along the shores of Lake Winnebago, and he went on to study the natural world, worked for a short while at the Field Museum in Chicago, but he spent the majority of his career at the Milwaukee Public Museum. He still lived here in Fond du Lac and spent a lot of time documenting the wildlife here in our county, as well as around the rest of the state. He's most known for his book, Birds of Wisconsin, which we have pictured here. He hand illustrated the book, taking note of the details of the various feather patterns, colors, and behaviors of these birds as well. And many of these birds were traveling birds, so it took him almost 20 years to document all of these different species. He also did a lot of work with painting animals in other countries. He did do a short study on animals in Africa, particularly in the Serengeti in Kenya. And so that's a very distinct art as well. He also was a taxidermist, and so he had quite a few items that he taxidermied for the Milwaukee Public Museum, as well as for private collectors. And as you can see here, we've got quite a few of his paintings here. Birds, of course, were his specialty, and he loved painting them and documenting them. The upper left-hand corner, you can see there is a fall lake, and that is called Return to Lake Denevue. And that is a painting of a lake here in Fond du Lac County, just outside of the city limits. In the bottom right corner, you can see there is the snow geese over Lake Winnebago. This one was donated to the Historical Society, and we offer prints of it in our gift shop. The other two paintings are some other examples of some of the paintings in his collections. Like I said, he's a very avid wildlife painter, and he also was a big conservationist. So we have him to thank to help to start the International Crane Foundation, which helped to bring back the whooping crane populations here in Wisconsin, as well as his influence in creating the Horicon Marsh. He was a very big advocate for conservation law and spent a lot of time meeting with legislators and encouraging them to focus on saving these animals and their habitats. The next artist we're going to talk about is a little later on in the 1930s and 40s, and that's Viola Smith. So Viola was a drummer. Now, she was very well known for growing up. She grew up in Mount Calvary, and she was part of her family orchestra. Now, she was one of 7 sisters, all of which who learned how to play an instrument, and Viola just loved playing drums. She became very well known for performing on TV with different live bands, and she toured around the country with a women's orchestra. She also had quite a bit of experience breaking into the industry. She wrote an article during the World War II encouraging radio producers as well as TV producers to allow women to play in big bands. At that point, bands were typically just men, and so during the war, there was a shortage of male musicians, and she really encouraged them to think quality versus quantity and having women take place in the music field. And as you can see here, she is displaying her lovely drum setup. She was famous for her 13 drum setup. And so as you can see, it was a very large setup to have for a bunch of drums, but she played it very well. You can see here that we have a couple of links to videos, and I encourage you just go on YouTube or go on to Google and look up Viola Smith, and you can see some of her performances, and it's just amazing to watch. Now, Viola is still around today. She lives out in California, and she's 107, and she's still making music yet today. So quite a well-known and popular artist here in Fond du Lac County. Now, the last artist we're going to talk about today is Clarence Addison Shaler. Now, Clarence didn't start out as an artist. In fact, he really didn't start making art until his 70s. Clarence actually became an entrepreneur. He was best known for patenting different inventions, and his 2 most famous ones were the reversible umbrella and the tire patch. Now, these tire patches were a big innovation during the early 1910s and 20s, and that was right at the edge of the start of the automobile age. And of course, at that time, roads were not designed for cars, so They were bumpy, they were either dirt or gravel, and were not easy on your tires. And of course, since cars weren't very popular, there really wasn't a repair shop or a gas station nearby. So these tire patches were a wonder to have. And of course, they sold like hotcakes. So after making his money that way and retiring, he really started to get into art and sculpture. And he had fallen in love with a number of different artists and their sculpture before, but it was really when he retired in his 70s that he was able to make his own art. Some of the examples are here on the screen. You can see the first one is a small family, and that one's called the Pioneers. And he dedicated that to the settlers that came to the Waupun area during that time. And you can kind of see on their faces the expression of hope with a little bit of fear, because of course it was a great time to be moving out to the Midwest, but it was also scary because coming to a new country after leaving Europe was a very intimidating process for many families. The next statue you see there is one of young Abraham Lincoln. And so this one is actually located at the Ripon College in Ripon. And it's definitely a neat portrayal and one of a few sculptures of the former president here in the Fond du Lac area. Now, the most famous sculpture that Clarence is associated with is this one. This is the sculpture of End of the Trail by James Earl Fraser. Now, when James Earl Fraser first made this sculpture, he made it as an 18-inch tall sculpture made out of plaster. So that's about the height of a Barbie doll, so not terribly big. And so it was an example that was used in his art school, and it was very well liked, and he was invited to join the Chicago World's Fair. And he had brought it to the fair, and he recreated it in a massive structure. Now this was 18 feet tall, so that's quite a height difference from 18 inches. And it was completely made out of plaster, and it was desired and loved. He made souvenir versions to give away or to sell during the fair, but Clarence was there to see the Chicago World's Fair and fell in love with the sculpture. And he had asked Fraser to help him bring it to Waupun. And so it was quite an endeavor to bring this lovely sculpture to Waupun. And you can see that it's made out of cast bronze. And they had this specialty commissioned in 1927. And it was meant to be a memorial to the Native Americans and the relocation that they were forced into to going to the coast. And Fraser had envisioned in his mind when making the sculpture the thought of a warrior making it to the west coast of the ocean in that exhaustion as he going to the end of the line. And then you can kind of see that it has quite a bit of detail to it. And so this required a lot of work, and it is very heavy. It's 3 tons of bronze, and it cost Shaler almost $50,000 to produce. Now, what is $50,000 of 1920s money in today's dollars? That's well over $1 million. So it was a very valuable gift to the community that Shaler had made. You can also see that it's been lovingly detailed. Now, it wasn't always in this great of condition. In the 1990s, it had been worn down. A lot of the finer details had been worn away by weather and by exposure. And so in the 1990s and 1997, they spent over 2.5 months restoring it and spent over $25,000 to do so. The sculpture also is a great representation of the importance of having art in our daily lives. And in the next slide here, you can kind of see some current ways you can see art here in Fond du Lac County. I always encourage people to check out the Fond du Lac Artists Association. It's a collaboration of all sorts of different artists, whether it's musicians, painting, photography, sculpting, any kind of art. They make a really good job of collaborating together to share their artwork. We also have here Thelma, which is the Thelma Sadoff Center for the Arts. That's another great resource if you're looking to find art here in Fond du Lac County. And of course, something you can do during the coronavirus pandemic is go outside and check out the Utility Box Art Project. Now, if you've driven around Fond du Lac in the past year, you might have noticed that on our utility boxes in downtown, there's various pieces of art. Now, this was a collaboration between Thelma, the library, and a number of other organizations to encourage artists to share their art with the community. Now,